Project Management for Healthcare Managers. Week 2, Corporate Culture, HTML 375. In the last section, we reviewed organizational strategy. There are formal and informal structures that align the members of the company to work together toward a common goal. The more intentional the structures and messaging the central mission are established and institutionalized, the greater the chance that each person in the company will align their other goals and objectives to the goals and objectives of the company. One of the major factors in determining whether organizational strategy will be followed by the staff is the culture of the company. The culture is typically not controlled by organizational leadership, and even the strongest strategy will crumble if the strategy goes against the norm of corporate culture. An example of this was an IT project that I was working on that wasn't progressing well. One of the programs purchased was a rule engine that was tied to the diagnosis code. When the diagnosis code was entered, the program checked this database and sent a form back to the doctor, verifying that they had run the required diagnostic tests. The project was falling behind due to resource constraint, but the root cause that this was an issue with corporate culture. The IT staff felt this was a clinical job function to build and maintain the program, and the clinical staff felt this was technology that IT should own. Both teams failed to show for meetings and delayed submitting the proper documentation. The unwritten rule was not to work on a function that you didn't want to own for life, so the staff were uncooperative and exhibited behaviors that delayed the project until the project was canceled. The initial charter included a business case that supported a strategic initiative, but the corporate culture ate it for lunch. In this case, corporate culture is the patterns, behaviors, values, and unwritten rules. The behaviors are the actions we can see. It's the sum of all actions that everybody takes at work, regardless if it contributes to the product or service. The values are the attitudes that each person has about what they do and how they feel about it. The unwritten rules are all the guidelines that people use to adapt to the norms of their environment. We can see the behaviors, but we cannot see a person's values. And the unwritten rule is how the people use values to guide and express their behavior. For example, there may be a written policy, work starts at 8 o'clock. When you read the start time, when you read the policy, it may state that the clock in time needs to be within 3 minutes of the published start time. And so you'd see the behavior of people to go in to the time clock between 7:57 and 8:03 punching in for work. The next set of behaviors is influenced by the values and unwritten rules. Does everyone immediately sit down at their desks and start doing their jobs? Is there times for folks to chat or stop at the restroom or start working after they've checked with their office mates to see how last night went? Motivation and past experience impact values in positive or negative ways. And the ways that people create norms in dealing with the work processes promotes a collective buy-in and reinforces the acceptance. Listed are some of the key factors that have an impact on culture, at least the factors that I want to explain in more detail. And there are more factors that contribute to establishing and maintaining culture within the organization. Most of the factors listed are influenced by organizational leaders and how they lead and manage. For each of these factors, there is likely a policy or program that impacts this factor on culture. However, the impact is felt on how the factors are treated by the leadership in the organization. Stakeholder impacts. Next week's focus is on leadership and sponsor engagement. And I want to focus on the other two stakeholder groups in this session. When we review the different styles of leadership and the differences between good sponsorship and poor engagement, consider the impacts on culture. One of the factors that affects culture is how decisions are made within the organization. For example, how are the members of a project team selected and assigned to a project? We learned last week that directive PMOs will assign project management staff to a project. How does the PMO select the members? Picking a member from the bench means to select someone who isn't doing anything. If the skills of all the PMs were the same, this would make sense from a productivity selection method. But if the best PM is the one with the highest skills, there are unwritten rules on how selection occurs. If the PMs who have the highest skills are given most of the critical projects, this leaves a surplus of less skilled PMs for the rest. There may be unwritten norms that encourage favoritism or special treatment, or message that good PM work is rewarded by more work. How PMs are selected ought to be the function of the PMO, but in many organizations there's an unwritten rule that favors good PMs. Another factor that has an impact on the culture of a project team is how much authority are they given to make decisions. Some sponsors want all the decisions to be vetted through them, and some say the team should make the decision. This factor can give a lot of support to managing team dynamics, or it can diminish team spirit if managed poorly. There's a lot of emphasis placed on empowerment and delegation in organizations. Getting people engaged and encouraging buy-in is a way to build loyalty, team spirit, and involvement. But empowerment means loss of power and control from the leadership level. For real empowerment, leaders should not only leave the decision to the staff, but they should have to support it. The person that sweeps the floor should choose the broom, but the leader needs to follow through and buy the chosen broom. This follow-through is critical for empowerment to work. Giving up the control for members to decide how things work is only part of the hard work for leaders, because they keep the hardest part. In empowerment and delegation, responsibility can be given, but accountability needs to stay with the leader. When done right, empowerment can inspire the culture of openness and working together, but making mistakes can make things culturally difficult. If a leader said to the group they had the power to make a decision, then contradicts the decision later, the members feel let down or betrayed. This leads to a culture of mistrust. Leaders are not required to give up decision-making control. They just need to be clear about their intention. If they empower a group to make a decision, they need to follow through and support it. If they don't feel comfortable letting a group decide, they just need to be directive and make the decision. Another factor in culture is whether the internal customers are treated different than the external customers. In project management, there are many projects that the customer is an operational team or another department. How departments interact depends on cultural norms. Is there a sense of collaboration, or do departments compete for resources? The idea of the customer is always right plays a huge part in project management to provide the outcomes and requirements for a project. Understand how customers are treated and how internal customers may not have as high expectation for success. Another factor in corporate culture is the leadership within a project or governance. Typically, the sponsor makes the decisions on a project, but in larger organization-wide projects, governance may be owned by a group of leaders. Large healthcare organizations typically have governance teams or councils to make decisions. Before a project even starts, the decision to start a project might be impacted by corporate culture. In the last section, cultures, we talked about projects that align with an organizational strategy and tactics and produce good outcomes that support the outcomes of the organization can be identified as good project candidates. But any project that goes against corporate culture may be doomed. Sometimes this is not a systemic decision process, but a decision made on leadership culture where an idea has an emotional hook and gets rapid attention, sometimes known as the shiny object. Organizations that choose new ideas and projects without foresight or follow-through may also crash and burn. However the project gets approved, the funding process is typically the least subject to corporate culture because most larger organizations leave money to the financial department. Good accounting practices can bring value to the cost management of a project, but this also disconnects the project manager from the value management process. When the project management is separate than the financial department, there can be adversarial relationships or simply a lack of understanding on how the other department works. As a healthcare leader, understanding the business of funding projects, as well as understanding projects, is key. Criteria for success is also important in corporate culture. Determining a healthy criteria for success can influence whether a culture contributes to organizational strategy or works against it. The best type of measurements use metrics, business metrics, strategic metrics, or customer value metrics. Having objective metrics makes it easier and can contribute to a fair assessment of success instead of a highly subjective criteria. Projects that promote self-interest or increase political power can have poor effect on culture and can wedge between good business strategy and culture. One of the worst approaches is to have a lack of criteria for success. It seems like this should be an everyone's a winner mentality. However, what you get is a project that can do a good job and leaders don't notice. Also, projects doing poorly and nothing happens. This apathy turns into the reward for finishing work is getting more work. Motivation is the personal values that connect strategy with culture. Motivation is that internal drive and personal initiative to get things done. Management theory used to think that most people had to be financially rewarded to be motivated to work, or have some sort of punishment for not working. This was known as Theory X. Theory Y was that people liked to work and found work to be satisfying in the sense of accomplishment. Motivation is more complex than these two opposing theories, and one of the greatest impact on motivation is reinforcement. More than just getting paid, reinforcement is the mutual benefit of achieving a goal and getting rewarded in a way that produces satisfaction and encourages behavior. Reinforcement is a key leadership skill in promoting culture to achieve the goals of the organization. One of the factors that impacts relationship within an organization is trust. I've been promoting trust as a cornerstone of leadership and effective team dynamics for years. Trust also extends to culture as well. When there's trust between leaders and staff and between team members, this drives a level of communication and ability to work together. Of all the workshops on trust that I've seen, the best I've heard is Brené Brown. She's an author, a speaker, and a research professor, specializing in topics like empathy and vulnerability. One of her workshops, sponsored by Oprah Winfrey, called The Anatomy of Trust, breaks the concept of trust into 7 characteristics. This explanation makes the most sense to me so far. Dr. Brown starts with the notion that trust is not a major event, but a series of actions and choices on how individuals treat each other. She compares trust to marbles in a jar, added one at a time or removed one at a time. The different actions or choices are arranged in the acronym BRAVING. The first is boundaries. When you understand another's boundaries and are willing to be considerate and not cross them, and that the other person is clear about your boundaries and doesn't cross them either. R is for reliability, is doing what you say you're going to do every time, consistently, not just once, but every time. Accountability is about ownership. In business, it's the tasks and processes that you are ultimately responsible for. But accountability is really going beyond that. If you make a mistake and are willing to own the behavior and the consequences, and are willing to apologize and make amends, then you're accountable. V stands for the vault. If you tell me something in confidence, I will not share it with others, as you will not share anything I tell you in confidence. Integrity is doing the right thing, doing what you say you're going to do. Non-judgmentalism is being able to talk about without the other person judging you on their values or expectations, but just accepting you for who you are. And G is for generosity, not thinking the worst about somebody's intention, but giving the benefit of the doubt. When considering working with others, not just in leadership roles, but as peers, how much trust you have and the others around you have a huge impact on culture. Another factor that affects culture is the effect of authority and influence. Authority is positional power and the ability to control another's actions based on status and position in the boss-worker relationship. This relationship is affected by trust and good leadership. There is an initial default in organizations that authority is given to a boss, but poor leadership and lack of trust can lead to apathy or resentment. Good leadership, reinforcement, communication, and trust building can increase influence as well as authority. Where authority is based more on control, influence is based on mutual consent, where behavior and accountability are built on interpersonal dynamics. In cultures that are high in communication and trust, then influence is the primary way to get things accomplished. Typically, project managers aren't directly positioned over teams or resources, and they lack the resources they manage, and they typically lack the authority and must use influence to get things done. Organizational stress also has effect on culture, which diminishes any positive factors that contribute to culture. Being aware of what seismic changes are happening in an organization is important to understand the attitudes and values of the leaders and the team. Factors like downsizing, unanticipated growth, merges, or restructure reduces trust and communication. And even when leadership and trust are doing a good job, people can feel like they have more to do and less time to do it. And there can be changes in staffing or management that affect culture and morale, even in the best workplaces. So in this section, we looked at culture. What is the definition of it? How do stakeholders impact culture, especially those that are the targets and those that are the project team? How is governance, or the decision to do project, or how leadership is exhibited within a project? And what are those criteria for success? Within the organization, how is success defined and established, and then that behavior exhibited? Motivation and reinforcement are really about taking that reinforcement, that leadership skill, and producing good personal motivation. We talked about the seven factors that make up the concept of trust, according to Brené Brown. We also talked about authority and influence and how much authority is out there for leaders, and that influence is really there for that mutual consent and working together. And then finally, we looked at organizational stress and its impact on culture.